The throne hall of Varanthos was empty, and Sergeant Callan Marsh stood in the doorway counting the things that were wrong. Dust on the armrests. That registered first. Fine gray powder settled into the grain of the dark mineral throne like silt in a dry riverbed, undisturbed for weeks, possibly months. A dried flower, something pale and curling at its edges, lay on the seat cushion, as though placed with ceremony, and then abandoned. The great chair sat on its dais at the far end of the hall like a monument nobody visited anymore, its pale gold veins catching the light from the lancet windows in thin, mournful threads. Second, no guards. The outer perimeter was unmanned. 3 approach corridors, 2 security checkpoints, and a retinal lock entrance that someone had wedged open with a strip of folded cloth. He had walked in through the front doors without challenge, without scan, without a single body in armor turning to acknowledge his presence. A palace that should have had 40 armed personnel on rotation had offered him nothing but architecture and silence. Third and worst, the Queen was not on her throne. Marsh set his transit case beside the nearest pillar and stood still, listening. The hall's acoustics were immaculate vaulted bone-colored stone, pillars carved with the spiral script of the Varanth noble houses, lancet windows set high enough to admit wind without rain. He could hear the shield generators humming in the palace's deep structure, a sound like a held breath, and somewhere farther inside, below the wind and the generators, a voice. One voice, female, reading aloud in the flat, measured cadence of someone working through an official document. He followed it. 3 corridors, each one showing the same quiet deterioration. A tapestry hanging with one corner unclipped, a light panel flickering in its sconce, a cleaning drone parked dead against a baseboard with its charge indicator dark. 2 guard posts, both vacant, their duty logs gathering dust on the sill. A maintenance hatch left ajar, the circuitry behind it exposed and oxidizing. The palace was not ruined, not gutted, not war-scarred, not stripped. It was neglected, the particular kind of neglect that happens when the person responsible for caring is still present, but has stopped looking outward. The voice led him deeper, past rooms he half recognized from another lifetime and rooms he did not recognize at all, until he reached a door that should have required biometric authorization, but stood propped open with a strip of wadded cloth. The records room, smaller than the throne hall, paneled in dark wood that smelled of resin and old binding glue, shelves climbing every wall from floor to ceiling, loaded with the thick-spined ledgers the Varanth used for official documentation. Hundreds of volumes, each spine embossed with dates and designations. At a desk in the center, lit by a single overhead lamp that cast a warm circle in an otherwise dim space, sat a woman. She was reading from a ledger. She did not look up. Marsh studied her from the threshold. Varanth female, tall, even-seated, her spine held straight with the unconscious discipline of someone taught posture before language. Skin the color of pale storm cloud, a soft luminous gray with a faint blue undertone that caught the lamplight like the inside of a shell. Pointed ears, the left one bearing a thin gold cuff that marked noble blood. Her hair was dark, not the silver or lavender common among Varanth women in the capital markets, but a deep near-black indigo that fell past her shoulders in an unbraided curtain. Her eyes, when the lamp caught them as she turned a page, were winter jade green so pale it was nearly white at the center, ringed with a darker edge that made them look lit from within. She wore a plain gray robe, no crown, no sigil, no attendants, a queen in a records room, alone with the names of her dead, reading them aloud as though the dead could hear. He knew who she was. He had known before he entered the palace grounds. Queen Thessaly of House Varanthos, sovereign of the Varanth Protectorate, last of the bloodline that had held the mineral throne for 19 generations. He had served in her court 11 years ago, before the war, before the siege, before the document that said he no longer existed. Court Record 4471 Null. He had found a copy of it 18 months ago in the Transit Authority's archive on Calliston Station, filed between a trade amendment and a water rights petition. A single page in Varanth script, stamped with the seal of the Queen's own chancery. Sergeant Callan Marsh, Terran attached guard, 2nd rotation. Status: killed in action, siege of the Cathara Valley. Body unrecovered. Service record closed. By order of Her Majesty Queen Thessaly, House Varanthos, let the record stand. 4 words at the bottom that had erased 11 years of his existence. Let the record stand. He had read them on a data terminal in a transit hub cafeteria, surrounded by strangers eating reconstituted protein, and the floor had shifted under his boots the way it shifts when the ground itself has been reclassified. He had not been killed at the Cathara Valley, but the record said otherwise, and in the Varanth Protectorate, the record was the only version of a man that anyone would acknowledge. The siege had collapsed the eastern fortifications on the 3rd day. Marsh had been positioned at the secondary fallback line when the bombardment struck. A wall of blast-shattered masonry came down across his legs, crushing his comm unit, filling his lungs with powdered stone. He lay in the dark for 9 hours. He counted everyone, because counting was the only labor a pinned body could perform. A young Varanth field medic named Tesserin pulled him free, shaking hands, clean sutures. Tesserin dragged him to a triage station that was nothing more than a tent and a handful of people pretending that proximity to medical supplies constituted care. The triage station was overrun the following morning. Tesserin died in the shelling. Marsh was loaded onto a refugee convoy heading south, unconscious and unidentified, entered into convoy records as an unknown alien casualty species Terran, name none, condition critical. The convoy crossed the border into neutral territory. The war sealed the border behind it. 3 years recovering in a neutral zone medical facility. His left leg rebuilt from surgical pins and exercises that felt like penance. The facility was a converted freighter hangar on a station called Meridian, staffed by volunteer doctors from 6 species who had agreed that wounded bodies held no allegiance. Marsh shared a ward with 14 other casualties: Varanth, Corvin, 2 Thessians, and a Dreven pilot who had lost both arms to shrapnel and spent his nights staring at the ceiling with an expression Marsh recognized as the particular stillness of a man deciding whether the next day was worth the effort. Marsh decided it was. Every day, without drama, without announcement, he decided it was. He learned to walk again on a leg that felt like it belonged to someone else. He learned to run again 6 months after that. He learned to stand for 8 hours without the joint swelling, and then 10, and then 12 because a guard stands, and the standing is not optional. During those 3 years, he wrote 11 letters to the Varanth Protectorate's Transit Authority requesting repatriation. The first 4 were returned with a form notice. Transit records show no active file for the named individual. The 5th through 9th received no response at all. The 10th was returned with a handwritten note from a clerk. Sergeant Marsh is listed as deceased. Court record 4471 null. We cannot process repatriation for a deceased individual. Please contact the originating chancery. The 11th letter was addressed to the Queen's Chancery directly. It was never acknowledged. 2 years working transit security on Calliston Station, filing requests for return passage to Varanth space that were denied, deferred, lost, refiled, and denied again. The security work was straightforward: checking credentials, scanning cargo manifests, standing post at docking gates while ships cycled through. It was not the work he wanted, but it was work that required standing for long hours and watching carefully, and those were the 2 things he was best at. The dock foreman, a heavyset Terran named Gareth, noticed his bearing on the 2nd day and asked if he was military. Marsh said formally. Gareth did not ask further. Good foremen knew when a man's history was heavier than his luggage. 6 more years, following the bureaucratic trail of a dead man trying to prove he was alive, drafting petitions in a legal system designed for the living, not the resurrected. He learned the Varanth petition format, the rigid hierarchical addressing structure, the mandatory citations of applicable charter provisions, the formal acknowledgement of the Chancery's authority that had to precede any request to that authority. He learned to write in Varanth script, teaching himself from a language primer he purchased at a second-hand stall on Calliston's lower market for the cost of a day's meal ration. His handwriting was poor but legible. His grammar was functional. His arguments were precise, because a soldier understands that precision is the difference between a round that lands and a round that does not. He filed 43 petitions over 6 years. Each one was denied on the same procedural ground. He kept copies of every denial in a folder he carried in his transit case, arranged by date, annotated with the name of the clerk who had processed the rejection. Not out of anger, out of thoroughness. A man who has been erased from the record learns to keep his own. Every petition met the same wall. Court Record 4471 Null. The Varanth transit authorities treated the document the way a priest treats scripture, not a thing to be questioned, but a fact to be observed. The record said he was dead. The Queen's Chancery had sealed it. Only the Queen could unseal it, and he could not reach the Queen because he could not enter Varanth space because the record said he was dead. A perfect closed loop, bureaucracy as coffin. He had finally gotten through on a technicality, a shipping clerk on Calliston who owed a favor to a dock foreman who owed a favor to Marsh. A cargo manifest quietly amended, a transit pass coded for agricultural inspection rather than personnel entry, a docking berth number scrawled on a napkin and passed across a cafeteria table. He had ridden into Varanth space in the hold of a grain freighter, sitting on crates of seed stock, watching the stars through a cargo viewport, thinking about the exact color of winter jade. He had served as her guard for 6 months before the siege. 6 months was not a long time by any calendar that mattered, but it had been long enough. Long enough to learn the rhythms of a palace, the cadence of a court, the particular architecture of a queen's loneliness. He had learned her schedule before he learned the layout of the palace. She rose before the staff. She read dispatches in the throne hall while the morning light came through the lancet windows at a low angle that turned the bone-colored stone to amber. She held petitions from the 9th hour to the 12th, and during those 3 hours her voice never wavered and her posture never shifted. But Marsh, standing at his post, 6 paces behind the throne, could see the slight movement she made when she thought no one was watching. The left shoulder lifting when a petition tried her patience. The almost imperceptible tightening around her eyes when a courtier bent the truth. The softening of her jaw when a child was brought before her, wide-eyed and trembling during the lower district audiences. He had said nothing about these observations. They were not his to share. A guard watches. A guard catalogues. A guard does not volunteer interpretations of his sovereign's unconscious expressions, because that would imply a familiarity that a guard has no right to claim. But he had noticed, and she had noticed him noticing. It happened incrementally, in the way that recognition always happens between 2 people who will not name what is growing between them. She began a pause at his post during the evening shift change, not to speak, not to give orders, but simply to stand in his proximity for a moment before continuing to her private chambers. He began to recognize the sound of her footsteps from 3 corridors away, the measured cadence, the particular weight distribution that came from years of walking on stone in formal shoes. She began to leave her dispatches on the table nearest his post, so that when she needed one, she had to cross the space he occupied, and for a moment they would exist within the same arm's length of air. Neither of them acknowledged any of this. It was understood the way gravity is understood, not through discussion, but through constant, quiet experience. Then the war dispatches arrived, and the court erupted into the controlled panic of a government preparing for a siege. And on the last night before everything changed, she came to his post. Now he stood in a doorway, watching a queen read a ledger of the dead in a palace falling apart around her, and the distance between the threshold and the desk was 6 paces, and 6 paces was the regulation distance a Varanth throne guard kept from his sovereign, and his body had measured it without his permission. He stepped across the threshold. The floorboard creaked old wood, dry, protesting weight it had not borne recently. The queen's head came up, and her jade eyes found him. For a moment she looked at him with the flat, unsurprised expression of a woman who had stopped expecting anything from open doors. "The hall is closed. If you have a petition, leave it with the chancery clerk, East Wing." Her voice was precise, controlled, each word placed like masonry, but the roughness at its edges was deeper than he remembered, worn into the grain of it like weathering in stone. "I do not have a petition, Your Majesty." She studied him more carefully. Her eyes moved across his face, his frame, his posture. He wore no armor, just the plain jacket and trousers of a transit worker, scuffed boots, a pack slung over one shoulder. He looked like what 11 years of exile had made him, a man who had traveled far on limited funds and slept in spaces not meant for sleeping. "The palace is not receiving visitors. I do not know how you pass the outer perimeter. The guards should have." She stopped. Something moved behind her eyes, not recognition, not yet, but an awareness that the sentence she was building rested on a foundation that no longer held. "There are no guards at the perimeter," Marsh said quietly. "The outer stations are unmanned. The throne hall doors were standing open. Your retinal lock on the south entrance is wedged with a cloth." The information landed without surprise. Only the dull acknowledgement of someone who had known things were failing and lacked the will to address them. "There have been reductions," she said. "How many guards remain?" 7, down from 40. 7, he kept his voice level, a field assessment, not a rebuke. "Your Majesty, 7 guards cannot secure a facility this size, the coverage alone." "I am aware of the deficiencies," the jade sharpened. "I asked who you are." "My name would not mean anything to you yet, Your Majesty." "That is not an answer." "No, it is not." He watched her register the words. "No, it is not." They had a specific weight in the space between them, a weight she could feel but could not yet place. Her brow contracted, not anger, the beginning of a question she did not know how to form. "You are Terran," she said. "Yes." "Terran military." "Formerly." "There has been no Terran military presence in the Protectorate since the security compact expired during the war." A pause. 11 years ago." "I know when it expired, Your Majesty." Something shifted in the air. She sat straighter, not the disciplined posture of a sovereign receiving a petitioner, but the unconscious straightening of a woman whose body had detected a signal her mind had not yet decoded. "You know this palace," she said, not a question. "You walked through 3 corridors and 2 checkpoints without hesitation. You identified the retinal lock failure at the south entrance without being told." Her voice hardened at the edges. "And you are standing exactly 6 paces from this desk." Marsh said nothing. 6 paces, she repeated. Her voice had changed, still controlled, but underneath the control something was beginning to vibrate, the way a wire vibrates when pulled to the edge of its tolerance. "The regulation distance for a Varanth throne guard. You are standing at guard distance in a records room, and you walked through my palace as though you had done it before." "I have walked through it before, Your Majesty." She rose from the chair. Not quickly, not with drama, with the measured deliberation of a woman who needed to be standing for whatever came next. The lamplight caught the gold cuff on her ear and the wet surface of her jade eyes, and her hands at her sides were trembling. "The Terran attached guard had 4 soldiers assigned to the Queen's personal rotation," she said. The steadiness of her voice cost her. He could see the price in the tension at her jaw, in the way her fingers curled against the gray robe's fabric. "Corporal Dunn, Specialist Voss, Private Alara Trent, and—" She stopped. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the loudest silence Marsh had ever inhabited, louder than the bombardment at the Kethara Valley, louder than 9 hours under a collapsed wall, louder than the cafeteria on Calliston Station, where he had read the words "Let the record stand," and felt the world tilt sideways on its axis. "Sergeant Callan Marsh," the Queen said. "Second rotation, killed in action, siege of the Kethara Valley. Body unrecovered." Her voice broke on the last word, not a sob, not dramatics, but the small structural failure of a sound that had been carrying too much weight for too long. "I wrote the record myself. Court record 4471 Null. I sealed it with my own chancery mark." "I know," Marsh said. "I read it." "You read it 18 months ago, on a data terminal at Calliston Station." Her eyes were glistening, not tears yet, but the dangerous shimmer of something held behind a wall, developing fractures faster than she could repair them. "You lift your left shoulder when a petition angers you," Marsh said quietly. "About half an inch. The trapezius tightens first." She made a sound, not a word, something caught between a breath and something breaking. "When a courtier lies to you, your eyes narrow at the outer corners. But when a child from the lower districts comes before the throne during the seasonal audiences, they soften, and the jade goes lighter at the center." Her hand found the edge of the desk. Not for balance, for proof. Something solid to confirm the room was real, that the voice she was hearing was not the kind that grief manufactures in the late hours when the ledgers are heavy and the lamplight casts shadows shaped like people who are gone. When you are tired, your voice roughens, the pitch drops, and it becomes the most honest version of your voice, the one people should hear, because it is the real one. A single tear crossed the threshold of her left eye and tracked down the gray pearl skin of her cheek. She did not wipe it. She stood beside her desk in the circle of lamplight and let it fall, and the tear caught the light like a thin river on stone. "The night before the siege," Marsh said, "you came to my post outside the throne hall. You said, 'You are the only one in this palace who has never asked me for anything.' I said, 'That is the job, your majesty.' And you said, 'No, it is not,' barely above a whisper. The roughness in her voice was not tiredness now. It was the sound of a word being spoken for the first time in 11 years by a woman who had believed she would never have cause to speak it again. The silence held. In the shelves around them, the ledgers stood in their rows, thousands of names. The dead of the Kethara campaign, the border skirmishes, the refugee convoys, the civilian counts. The Queen's private archive of loss, arranged by date and designation, read and reread in lamplight until the ink had been worn smooth by the passage of her eyes. "How?" The word broke from her like something that had been locked in a sealed vault. "The valley collapsed. I ordered 3 search operations. They recovered 17 bodies and none of them were yours. And I waited for the 4th report and the 5th and the 6th. And every report said the same words, body unrecovered. Body unrecovered, until the words stopped meaning anything, and I wrote the record because a queen does not leave a name in limbo. Because someone had to close the file, because you carry every name," Marsh said. 4,216 service personnel. Civilian casualties separate, East Alcove. She stared at him. "The total is embossed on the spine of the summary ledger behind you. 3rd shelf, 2nd row. I read it when I entered the room." "You counted my shelves." "I assessed your room, your majesty. It is what I do. It is what I have always done." She sat back down, not because she chose to, but because her body made the decision for her, folding her into the chair with the graceless honesty of a woman whose legs had stopped cooperating. She pressed both hands flat on the open ledger, fingers spread wide, bracing against the desk as though the room might tilt. "I was buried under the east wall," Marsh said. He kept his voice, even a field report, not a plea. She had earned the facts, and the facts were what he owed her. 9 hours under rubble. A medic named Tesserin pulled me out. The triage station fell the next morning. Tesserin died in the shelling. I was loaded onto a refugee convoy, unconscious, unidentified. The convoy crossed the border. The border sealed behind it. And then, her voice was flat. She was building the timeline, filling the silence with arithmetic, imposing structure on the unbearable. 3 years recovering. Neutral zone medical facility. My left leg was rebuilt from pins and stubbornness. And then, 2 years on Calliston Station. Transit security work. Filing return passage requests to Varanth space. The requests were denied, not a question. Every one. Court record 4471 null. The transit authorities would not process passage for a man the Protectorate listed as dead. I could not enter the system because I did not exist in the system. 6 more years. She was adding the numbers the way a sovereign adds casualties, methodically, mercilessly, refusing to look away from the sum. Petitions, appeals, counterfilings. I learned your legal code well enough to draft motions in Varanth script. Every motion was rejected on the same grounds sealed by the Queen's chancery. Only the Queen can unseal, and I could not reach the Queen because I could not enter Varanth space because the record said I was dead. The circular impossibility of it hung between them, like a knot whose every strand led back to every other strand. "How did you get here?" she asked. A shipping clerk on Calliston owed a favor to a dock foreman who owed a favor to me. I rode in the hold of a grain freighter. She closed her eyes. When she opened them, the jade was bright and wet and furious, not at him, at the machinery, at the record. At 11 years of bureaucratic certainty that had kept a living man on the wrong side of a border, while the woman who had written his death sat alone reading his name. Marsh let the fury run. He did not interrupt it or try to ease it. Fury was the correct response. She was a sovereign discovering that her own chancery seal had functioned as a prison wall for one of her guards, and the proper emotion was rage, and he would not take that from her by offering comfort she had not asked for. When her breathing steadied, he spoke. "I need to tell you something, Your Majesty, and I need you to hear it as a field report, not a judgment." "Say it." "Your palace is not defensible. 7 guards cannot cover the perimeter, the interior checkpoints, and the throne hall simultaneously. Your retinal locks are disabled or compromised. Your drone maintenance is offline. The tapestry in the second corridor is a fire hazard, one corner unclipped, hanging directly over a powered light sconce. Your shield generators are running at baseline, which means they have not been recalibrated since the last firmware cycle. If someone tested them with a focused pulse, they would fail at the junction seams." She listened without interrupting. Her expression stayed composed, but her fingers pressed harder against the ledger, whitening at the knuckles. "The cleaning systems are unpowered. The duty logs at both interior checkpoints have not been signed in weeks. 3 of the 7 remaining guards are performing duties that should be automated, but cannot be because the automation is down. Your complement is stretched past the breaking point, and the breaking point was behind you months ago." He paused. He needed the next words to land precisely. "You have spent 11 years in this room, Your Majesty, carrying 4,000 names, reading every record, checking every pension, noting every discrepancy. And while you did that, the palace around you went unguarded, and the throne gathered dust, and the people who are still alive, the ones who need a sovereign on that chair, have been waiting for you to come back to them. You are speaking above your rank, Sergeant. I am reporting a perimeter breach. A man walked into your palace today without being challenged. That man happened to be me. The next one may not share my intentions." The words landed. He watched them register not as insult but as truth she had known and refused to face, because facing it would have meant leaving this room, and leaving would have meant setting down the dead, and she had not been ready. "I was not ready," she said, reading his thought with the uncanny precision of a woman who had once spent 6 months being watched by a man who noticed everything, and had then spent 11 years in the absence of that attention. I was not ready to stop carrying them. You do not have to stop, you carry them from the throne. That is where a queen carries her dead, not in a records room, not alone, not behind unguarded doors. From a position of strength, with her perimeter secured and her guards at their posts. Because the best way to honor the dead, Your Majesty, is to protect the living. She looked at him for a long time. The tears had dried on her cheeks, 2 faint tracks on gray pearl skin, catching the lamplight. And behind her eyes something had shifted, the way light shifts when a door opens in a room that has been sealed too long. What are you proposing, Sergeant? I am not proposing anything. I am reporting for duty. Your service record is closed. Then reopen it. The Terran-Varanth Security Compact expired during the war. There is no legal framework for. Then make one. You make it sound simple. The paperwork is not simple, Your Majesty, but the thing itself, a guard returning to his post, is the simplest thing in the world. She looked at the ledger in front of her. His name was in there, somewhere in those pages. She turned back through the entries, her fingers moving with the careful precision of someone searching for a specific line in a book she had read 1,000 times. She found the page. He saw his name there, upside down from where he stood, Varanth script, the date, the designation, the 4 words at the bottom. Let the record stand. The Queen picked up a stylus from the desk. She drew a single clean line through the entry, not a slash, not an angry stroke, but a deliberate horizontal line, the kind a sovereign draws when she is correcting the record rather than destroying it. Court Record 4471 Null is hereby voided, she said. Her voice was steady, not the controlled steadiness of performance, but the natural steadiness of a woman who had found the ground beneath her feet. Sergeant Callan Marsh, Terran Attached Guard, 2nd Rotation, is restored to active status. Service record reopened, effective immediately. Understood, Your Majesty. She set the stylus down. For a moment she rested her hand on the page, palm flat over the crossed-out entry, as though pressing the correction into the paper itself. Then she drew her hand back and folded both hands in her lap, and her posture shifted, shoulders leveling, chin lifting a fraction, the geometry of a woman who was remembering how to sit like a queen rather than a mourner. The outer perimeter will be secured by end of day, she said. The retinal locks will be reactivated. The guard rotation will be rebuilt. I want a minimum of 20 before the seasonal audiences begin. Yes, Your Majesty. The shield generators will be recalibrated. The drone maintenance will be restored. The duty logs will be kept current. Yes, Your Majesty. And the throne hall will be reopened. Yes, Your Majesty. She paused, her hands in her lap were still, not clenched, not bracing, resting. The kind of stillness that comes after a long time of holding on. The dust on the armrests, she said quietly. I will handle it personally, Your Majesty. She met his eyes. The jade was bright, and the tiredness was still there, but it was different now, the tiredness of a woman who had been carrying a weight alone and had just felt someone else reach for the edge of it, not taking it from her, standing beside her, reaching for his share of the load. You walked here, she said, across 11 years, a closed border, a death record, an expired treaty, a cargo hold full of grain. Yes. Why? The question was quiet, and it was not the question of a queen to a soldier. It was the question of a woman who had spent 11 years alone with the names of her dead, and needed to understand why one of those names had risen from a page and walked into her records room, and stood at guard distance, and known the things about her that only one person in the Varanth Protectorate had ever learned. Marsh looked at her, this queen in a plain gray robe, without crown, without sigil, without attendants, a woman who had memorized the count of every person she had lost because she believed that sovereignty meant carrying the weight of failure alongside the weight of rule, who had left her throne empty because she could not sit on it while the records were still unread, who had let her palace fall quiet around her because the living had never felt as urgent as the dead. Because the job was never the job, Your Majesty. You told me that on the last night before the siege. You said, no, it is not. And you were right. It was never the job. Her breath caught. The jade glistened, and the light in it was not grief. It was the thing that lives on the other side of grief, the thing grief becomes when it discovers that what it was mourning is still alive. Then what was it? She asked, and her voice was the tired voice, the roughened voice, the honest one he had carried in his memory for 11 years like a frequency he could not stop hearing. Devotion, he said. The word settled into the room the way a stone settles into still water. The ripples moved outward through the lamplight and the old bindings and the shelves of names, through the 11 years of silence and the 6 paces of regulation distance, and they reached the queen in her chair and the soldier at the threshold, and the space between them became something neither of them would name but both of them would protect. She did not rise. She did not cross the room. She did not reach for him or speak words that would have made the moment smaller than it was. She sat in her chair and looked at him with jade eyes that were wet and wide and completely present, and she nodded. Once. The way a sovereign nods when something has been understood at a depth that language cannot follow. But her eyes said more than the nod. And he heard it, the way he had always heard what she did not speak, with the steady, patient attention of a man whose single qualification was that he had never stopped watching. Marsh picked up his pack. He walked back through the 3 corridors, past the empty guard posts, past the wedged retinal lock. He entered the throne hall and crossed to the dais, set his pack beside the pillar and took his position at the base of the steps, 6 paces from the throne, hands behind his back, eyes forward, weight even. The hall was empty. The dust lay on the armrests. The wind threaded through the lancet windows. The dried flower curled on the cushion. He stood his post. The first thing he did was remove the wedge from the south retinal lock. He found the access panel, ran a manual diagnostic, and confirmed that the scanner hardware was functional. It had simply been disabled by someone who had grown tired of being the only person whose retina the system recognized. He reactivated it. The green indicator light pulsed to life with a steady, patient rhythm, and the south corridor sealed with a quiet hiss of magnetic bolts finding their housings. Within the hour, the first of the remaining 7 guards appeared, a young Varanth male named Orath, pulling on a uniform jacket that had not been worn in weeks, his expression caught between confusion and alarm. "The south entrance lock just activated," Orath said, slightly breathless. "I did not authorize a reactivation." "Who?" "I reactivated it." "Sergeant Callan Marsh, Terran attached guard. The Queen has restored my service record as of this morning. I need your perimeter status." Orath stared. "There is no perimeter status report, sir. We stopped filing them after Commander Haleth resigned." "When did Haleth resign?" 6 months ago. There has been no replacement. The rotation has been informal." "Define informal." Orath's jaw tightened. The look on his face was the look of a professional who knew the standards had collapsed and had been waiting for someone to make him say it out loud. 3 of us cover the palace in shifts. Myself, Guard Velen, and Guard Sarath. The other 4 are technically on roster, but they have not reported in weeks. 2 took labor contracts in the capital. 1 transferred to the Port Authority. 1 I have not been able to reach. So the actual complement is 3. "Yes, sir, 3. Marsh absorbed that. 3 guards for a palace complex that spanned 47 rooms, 4 wings, and an exterior perimeter with 6 access points. The arithmetic was not difficult, and the answer was not reassuring. The 3 who left roster, were they discharged or did they abandon post? There was no one to discharge them or report the abandonment, Sergeant. Commander Haleth was gone. The Queen, Orath hesitated. The Queen has been in the records room. She has not issued operational orders in months. She has issued them now. The perimeter is to be secured. I need you to contact the guards who have not been reporting. If they can be recalled, recall them. If they cannot, I need to know by sundown so I can begin recruitment. Recruitment. Oreth said the word as though it belonged to a language he had not spoken in a long time. Sir, the treasury allocations for guard complement were frozen after the war. There is no budget for. I will address the budget with the Queen. Your task is the recall. Can you do it? The young guard studied him for 3 seconds. Marsh held still and let himself be assessed the scuffed boots, the transit worker's jacket, the pack on the floor beside the dais, the posture that did not match any of it. Whatever Oreth saw in that assessment settled his hesitation. Yes, sir, Oreth said, and left the hall at a jog. The work was methodical and it was necessary, and it was the kind of work that Marsh understood in his bones. Secure the perimeter, identify the failures, fix what could be fixed with the tools at hand, catalog what required resources he did not yet have, build a list, assign the list, follow up. It was the same discipline he had practiced at Calliston Station, the same discipline he had practiced in the neutral zone medical facility, the same discipline he had practiced under the rubble of the Cathara Valley when the only task available to him was counting the hours and keeping his breathing shallow so the dust did not choke him. Discipline was not a skill. It was a decision, renewed every morning, to treat the work in front of you as though it mattered, because it did. Over the next 3 hours, Marsh rebuilt the skeleton of a security operation from what remained. He located guard Velen, a Varanth woman, older than Orath, with the quiet bearing of someone who remembered what the palace had been before the war hollowed it out. She brought him a status report on the shield generators. Baseline operation. No firmware update in 14 months. Junction seam integrity at 61%. The generators need a full recalibration, Marsh told her. 4 hours minimum. I will run it tonight 200 to 600 when the load is lowest. Velen looked at him with an expression he recognized, a professional who has been watching standards erode and has just encountered someone who intends to drag them back. The Queen, she said carefully. Does she know you are doing this? She authorized my return. She ordered the perimeter secured and the locks restored. She has not given operational orders in a very long time, Sergeant. I know where she has been. She is coming back. Velen held his gaze. Then she nodded, not the nod of someone obeying an order, but the nod of someone who had been waiting a long time for someone to say what needed to be said. What do you need from me? Interior checkpoints. Throne Hall records corridor in the Queen's residential wing. 3 positions. You, Sarath, and whoever Oreth manages to recall. I want eyes on all 3 by sundown. Sarath is on the east wing. I will pull her to the residential checkpoint and take the records corridor myself. Good. And Velen the tapestry in the second corridor. One corner is unclipped and hanging over a powered light sconce. It is a fire hazard. Fix it before you take your post. Something shifted in Velen's face, a subtle loosening around the eyes, the look of a soldier who has been reminded that details matter and has missed someone who noticed them. Yes, sir, she said. Marsh spent the next hour on his knees in the south corridor, replacing a circuit board in the 4th retinal lock, the one that had been dead longest, its access panel oxidized, its wiring corroded at the junction points. He found a replacement board in a supply closet on the lower level, still sealed in its original packaging, layered in dust. He cleaned the contacts with a borrowed solvent kit, seated the board, ran the diagnostic, and tested the scanner against his own retina. The system rejected him. Terran biometrics were not in the database. He made a note to have the Queen authorize a biometric addition. He was closing the panel cover when he heard footsteps behind him, measured, unhurried, the cadence of a woman who had spent a long time sitting still and was now remembering how to move with purpose. He did not turn. A guard finishes the task, secures the panel, and then reports. The footsteps stopped 3 paces behind him. "The throne hall," the queen said. "Secured, your majesty. Orath is posted at the main entrance. Guard Velen holds the records corridor. Guard Sarath is en route to the residential wing. The perimeter locks. 3 of 4 cardinal locks reactivated. I am finishing the 4th now. It will be live within 2 minutes. The shield generators. Baseline, 61% junction integrity. I will run a full recalibration tonight between 200 and 600. A silence. Then, quietly, "You are kneeling on my floor with a borrowed toolkit, replacing a circuit board, 3 hours after being restored to active duty." 3 hours and 22 minutes, your majesty. And you have already reorganized my guard complement, identified a fire hazard in the 2nd corridor, diagnosed my shield generator degradation, and begun a phased lock restoration. The tapestry has been reclipped. Velen handled it. Another silence. He heard her breathing steady, controlled, but with a catch at the end of each exhale that told him she was holding something back. Something that was not grief and was not fury. Something warmer than either. "Sergeant, your majesty, look at me." He secured the last connector, closed the panel cover, and stood. He turned to face her. She had changed. Not her clothing, she still wore the plain gray robe, still had no crown, no sigil. But something in her carriage was different. She stood the way she had stood 11 years ago, before the war, shoulders level, chin raised, spine straight, not from discipline but from intention. The posture of a woman who had decided to occupy space, as though the space owed her the courtesy of being occupied well. "I am going to the throne hall," she said. "I am going to sit on the throne. The dust will be on the armrests, and the flour will be on the cushion, and the hall will be emptier than it has been in 19 generations. And none of that matters, because a dead man walked through my front door today and told me the living palace needs its queen, and the dead man was right. Yes, your majesty. You will be at your post." "I am always at my post, your majesty." She held his gaze for one more second, one held, luminous second in which the corridor and the panel and the borrowed tool kit, and the 11 years between them, compressed into something as simple and irreducible as a guard, standing 6 paces from his sovereign. Then she turned and walked toward the throne hall, her stride long, her footsteps steady on the stone, and Marsh watched her go and felt the coal in his chest, the one that had burned for 11 years, through the rubble and the darkness and the medical wards and the transit hubs and the cargo holds, settle into something quieter, not extinguished, resolved, a fire that had found the hearth it was always meant to occupy. He finished the lock, tested it. The retinal scanner hummed to life, green indicator steady. He rose, secured the tool kit, and walked to the throne hall. The queen was sitting on the throne. The dust was on the armrests. She had not brushed it away. The dried flower was in her hand. She had picked it up from the cushion and held it between her fingers, turning it slowly, its curled petals catching the light from the lancet windows. Marsh crossed the hall and took his position, 6 paces from the dais, at ease, hands behind his back. Orath was at the main entrance, standing straighter than he had stood in months. Through the open doors, Marsh could see the green indicator of the south lock pulsing in the corridor beyond. The shield generators hummed in the deep structure. The wind moved through the windows. "Sergeant," the queen said from the throne behind him. "Your majesty. This flower, do you know what it is?" "No, your majesty." "A Kethara bloom. They grow wild in the valley, the Kethara Valley. After the siege, after the search operations ended, after every report said the same words, I went to the valley myself. I walked the debris field for 2 days. I found nothing. But the blooms were growing in the rubble, the way they do. They push through broken stone, through the cracks where the masonry has split and the rain gets in. I picked one. I brought it back. I placed it on the throne, and I did not sit in this chair again. A headstone for a man who had not died, placed on a throne by a queen who believed she was burying the last person who had ever seen her without pretense. I am going to keep it, she said, not on the throne, on the desk in the records room. Because that room is where I learned what it costs to be responsible for 4,000 names, and the flower is part of that cost now. I do not want to forget what it took to sit in this chair again. Understood, Your Majesty. Silence, the kind that holds things rather than emptying them. Then, so quietly he almost lost it beneath the wind and the generators. Thank you for coming back, Sergeant. He did not turn. A guard does not turn from his post, but his voice was steady, and the steadiness was not discipline. It was the sound of a man who had found the only place in the universe where he was supposed to stand. There was never anywhere else to go, Your Majesty. The throne hall held them. The queen on her throne, the guard at his post, and between them 6 paces of stone floor that regulation prescribed and devotion inhabited. The dust on the armrests would be cleaned by evening. The remaining locks would be live by morning. The guard rotation would be rebuilt, the shield generators recalibrated, the drone maintenance restored, the duty logs kept current. The seasonal audiences would resume. The chancery would reopen. The tapestries would hang straight, and the light panels would burn steady, and the cleaning drones would hum through the corridors in their patient, circular routes. The palace would breathe again. Oreth returned to the throne hall at midday with a report. Of the 4 guards who had left roster, 2 were willing to return. The 3rd had signed a binding labor contract with the capital's port authority and could not break it. The 4th had not responded. Marsh accepted the report, noted the names, and began drafting a recruitment authorization for the Queen's review new guards, new contracts, a rebuild from 7 to 20 over the next 60 days. He wrote it on a sheet of palace stationery he found in a supply drawer, using a Varanth stylus whose grip was designed for 6-fingered hands and required him to hold it like a surgical instrument. Guard Sareth arrived at her post in the residential wing and sent a runner to the throne hall with a message. The Queen's private chambers were secure, the corridor locks were functional, and the environmental controls were operating within normal parameters. The message ended with a single line that Sareth had clearly added on her own initiative. It is good to have orders again. By evening, the 4 cardinal retinal locks were live and tested. The tapestry in the 2nd corridor was reclipped. The duty logs at both interior checkpoints had been signed for the first time in weeks. The cleaning drone in the east corridor had been recharged and set to its route. Velen had run a preliminary sweep of the records room corridor and reported it clean. Oreth had secured the main entrance and submitted a perimeter status report, the first one filed in 6 months. Marsh stood his post. The Queen sat on her throne and read from a datapad not a ledger of the dead, but a treasury summary, the kind of document a sovereign reads when she is preparing to govern rather than mourn. Occasionally she looked up from the datapad and her gaze crossed the hall to where Marsh stood at the base of the dais, and each time her expression carried something that was not a command and not a question and not a plea. It was recognition. Simple, steady recognition. The look of a woman who had spent 11 years in a room full of names and had just watched one of those names stand up and take his post. In the late afternoon, a courier arrived from the capital with a sealed diplomatic pouch. Oreth intercepted the courier at the perimeter, the first proper interception the palace had performed in months, verified credentials, logged the arrival in the duty book, and escorted the courier to the throne hall. Marsh watched the process from his post at the dais and noted that Oreth's movements were crisper than they had been that morning, his voice more certain, his bearing straighter. Structure did that to people. When the framework held, the people inside it stood taller. The Queen received the courier, broke the seal, read the dispatch, and dictated a response to a scribe she had summoned from the East Wing, the first scribe summoned to the throne hall and what the scribe herself, a gray-haired Varanth woman named Tesseth, described as longer than I care to admit, Your Majesty. The response was crisp, direct, and bore the marks of a mind that had not atrophied during its years in the records room. It had only been pointed in the wrong direction. At dusk she rose from the throne. She descended the dais steps, and as she passed Marsh she paused. Sergeant, Your Majesty. The records room. I have left the ledger open on the desk, the page with your entry. The line I drew through it. Yes, Your Majesty. When you do your security audit tonight, you will see it. Yes, Your Majesty. I wrote something in the margin. Her voice was quiet and the roughness was there, the honest version, the tired version, the one he had crossed 11 years to hear again. Below the line, in the space where the old record used to be. She did not tell him what she had written. She passed him and walked toward the residential wing, her footsteps steady on the stone, and Orath straightened at the entrance as she went, and Velen dipped her head in the corridor, and the palace moved around its queen the way a body moves around a pulse that has returned. Marsh stood his post until the shift change. Then he walked the perimeter, all 6 access points, each lock tested, each corridor swept. He checked the shield generators and logged the firmware version and the junction integrity readings for the recalibration he would perform at 200. He checked the environmental systems, the water supply, the emergency lighting circuits. He noted 3 additional maintenance items and added them to the morning's task list. At 2300, he entered the records room. The lamp was still on. The ledger was open on the desk, turned to the page the Queen had indicated. He saw his name in Varanth's script, the date, the designation, the 4 words that had kept him in exile. And through those words, a single clean horizontal line in the Queen's hand. Correction, not destruction. Below the line, in the margin, in small precise Varanth script, she had written 4 words to replace the 4 that had held him. Not let the record stand. Let him stay. Marsh looked at those words for a long time. Then he closed the ledger gently, set it back on the shelf in its place among the thousands of names the Queen had carried, and returned to the throne hall. He took his post. The palace was dark and quiet around him, its corridors lit by the soft green pulse of reactivated locks, its perimeter sealed, its generators humming in the deep structure. 6 paces from the empty throne, hands behind his back, weight even, eyes forward. Guarding. The way he always had, the way he always would, not because it was the job. Because it was devotion. And the record at last was corrected.